Your Honor.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Professor Messamore. So in my own mind then, when we broke before lunch, we had been talking about some of the events that took us up to the point of Confederation. The British North America Act 1867 is important for that event. And I wanted to turn to now some of the things after, but there's been a lot of testimony in the last couple of days about sections 111 and 112 of the BNA Act. Do you recall some of that?
Yes, I do.
And at the risk of making it even more muddy, I thought that maybe we should take some time to try to make sure that everybody in the room is clear about what these provisions mean. Because of course, as we go forward, they're very important. So in your council's compendium, I don't have electronically. Oh, apparently we do. Thank you. Section 111 is behind tab 1, I believe, of the compendium, and it's now on the screen.
Yes.
Okay. And I can really do nothing more than to just read it out. Canada shall be liable for the debts and liabilities of each province existing at the Union. You agreed with me, I think, this morning that this was in some of the early Galt ideas and certainly in the Quebec resolutions. May I put it that way?
Yes.
Okay. And then, to your understanding, this is a still active part. This is a still enforced part of the Constitution. Do you understand that to be true?
I didn't.
Not a lawyer, not sure.
No.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. You agree with me that this provision, though, it's not limited to the UPC, the Province of Canada, right?
Which provision?
I'm at 111.
111. Oh, I understand. So it reflects all the colonies.
The colonies existing at the Union, all of
Yes.
their debts. and
Yes, that's
liabilities.
correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to make sure that we knew that this was not something specific to the UPC, what I
Yes.
call the UPC, you
I
call the Province of
understand.
Canada.
Yes.
And if I suggested to you that this created new debtor-creditor relationships, do you understand what I mean by that? Would you agree with that?
I do understand. Yes, I suppose. Well, perhaps.
I think
Perhaps
this is
not
best
the-
left to argument.
If I suggested to you that this made Canada the port of first call, would that be something that you would agree with? People were coming to Canada now for payment.
Yeah, I was just about to say that was likely to be a
Okay.
ambiguous phrase, but that typically payment would be made by the Dominion and then recouped from the debt accounts of the provinces.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So the relationship between the people owed money was now with Canada, not the UPC.
Well, if indeed there was a relationship, I mean, I'm not sure that there was. In many cases, it was just a matter of particular items coming forward that required payment. And Canada would pay typically and then seek to charge the provincial debt account if applicable, right?
Right.
Yeah.
After Confederation.
After Confederation, correct.
And then in my own mind, and hopefully yours and others as well, one of the documents that you actually took us to, I think it was yesterday was Monday, yesterday, it sort of, I thought, neatly explained things, and it is Edward Blake's memo of July 1875. And that's in our compendium at tab 7, and it's at page 61. Maybe we could turn that up. I'll just ask you, after you find it, if you recognize this document. It's signed on the next page over by Edward Blake.
Sorry, what?
I'm at page 61, Your Honor, of
Got it.
tab 7
yeah.
of Ontario's compendium.
So when you said a moment ago a document that explains things, I think is how you
Well,
put
I'm
it.
going to put some
Oh.
things to you about it, but do you agree with me that, do you recognize this document?
do,
As being
yeah.
the one that you talked about the other day?
Yes.
Okay, and in fact, and there's no secret about this, I'm not trying to catch you in anything. You were talking about that this was in the context of Mr. Blake and Mr. Mowat, Premier Mowat, agreeing to increase the annuities in 1875 to $4. Do you recall that?
Can you tell me what this is? It's a letter from Blake to,
I believe it's actually a memo, Your Honor.
from,
It
to,
doesn't, it's from Edward Blake. We know that he's the Minister of Justice at this time. That's in Professor's, Professor Messamore's cast of characters. I don't think that it's not addressed to anybody. I think it's an internal, what we might call a briefing note or a memo now from the Department of Justice internally. Unless Professor Messamore can provide us with any other information, that's my understanding.
I don't know that it matters, but I could look it up and determine if I found it addressed to anyone.
Right.
okay, and the question was?
If she agrees, I'm remembering her testimony and her report as indicating that this was written in the time period that the Minister of Justice, the Federal Minister of Justice, Edward Blake, and Oliver Mowat, the Premier and Attorney General of Ontario, were going back and forth, if you will, about whether there should be an augmentation to $4 of the annuities.
I believe actually that this might not be the particular document that that I referred to. It might be. I'm just trying to look through it because I do recall that Edward Blake very pointedly said, "Yes, I agree that we should pay the claim without prejudice." And I'm not seeing that here. I'm just trying to quickly scan it.
There was, where I believe you took us to is the very last paragraph of his memo here, where he's talking about just postponing the arrears for a while.
Well, that's something different though.
Okay.
Yeah, so the arrears was different from what would be paid going forward,
Oh,
you see.
of course.
So, yeah, so what I think I cited, and I may have cited this one, I'm not sure.
Ms. Jones?
I wonder if I might help actually, because Professor Messamore deals with this particular memorandum. You had mentioned in testimony.
Yeah.
At,
Do you have a slide reference for me?
yeah, the slide reference is 175, and there, and the report is 892. So,
Thank you.
Yeah.
then you'll be able to see more clearly whether this is a document.
Thank you.
Yeah, so it does show that it is indeed a memorandum. And this is yeah, I guess I quoted this in the, okay, would have been properly claimable. I'm looking for that phrase in here. Bottom of the third paragraph. Oh, yes, there we are. Yeah, so that part's not highlighted. A certain augmentation
Yes.
would have been properly claimable. That's correct. Yeah, I think what jumped out at me was the highlighted part saying the question of arrears should be postponed for a while, and that's, as I indicated, a separate question. Yeah.
And I thank my friend for her assistance in that. When I said that I wanted to raise in the context of 111 and 112, though, I want to direct your attention to what else Minister Blake says, the Minister of Justice says. And at the bottom of page 61, the very last paragraph, page 61 of the compendium,
Yes.
you also have it on the screen. It's
Mhm.
hard to read, I know.
No, it's fine.
He agreed with me that he sets out what section 111 says.
Yes, that's correct.
And then over on the next page, he references and sets out the language of the 109th section of the same act. So
Yes,
that's what we've been looking at this week.
yes.
And then Minister Blake goes on, and in the highlighted paragraph there, he says, "It appears to the undersigned that the liability to the Indians to which he has referred," I take it there he's referring to the $4 augmentation, This whole
Ye-
letter is about augmented.
Yes, yes, before we deal with the arrears, yes. Uh-huh.
Comes within, it looks like it's the 11th section. I'm going to
That's-
suggest you it's the transcription.
Yeah,
issue.
I do remember that. It is, it
He means
said,
the
he means
111th
111th, I would agree. Yeah.
Thank you. So it comes within the 111th section. And this, whether or no, what a typo perhaps, Canada be entitled to claim that the lands in question are under the 109th section charged in any way with the satisfaction of that liability.
Okay, yeah, I
You see
agree.
that?
That's the
It
text.
goes
Yeah.
on to say that Ontario disputes that. That's not an issue per se.
Okay.
Well, it's not contested that Ontario disputed it.
Yes.
So I'm going to suggest to you that, Edward Blake, he was a preeminent lawyer of the day. Would you
Yes,
agree
he
with that?
was. Yeah, he was Minister of Justice. Yeah. And criminal
And
lawyer.
I think as you mentioned, maybe in or one of the reports mentioned that he started the law firm, Blake Castles and Graydon.
Okay, I didn't mention that, but
Okay,
I'll
that's
leave
good.
that.
So I'm going to suggest to you that, Blake kind of got it, if I can put it that way. Do you agree with me that what he's saying here is we can go on and talk about who's liable for what amount, but we, the government of Canada, have to pay the Indians up front because of Section 111. Would you agree with that?
No, I'm afraid I'm just not able to analyze this language as someone who's not a lawyer. I'm not quite sure what this means, to tell you the truth. I read this communication because I was concerned with, did he agree that amounts should be paid based on what we all think the yields have been thus far, and also that that the issue of arrears should be postponed for the moment. But to tell you the truth, I'm not entirely sure what that paragraph means.
So you wouldn't agree to me then that the liability, what he's speaking of, is for the augmentation of $4. Let's break it down.
I'm sorry, we agree on this point, that he's speaking about the augmentation of $4.
That's the liability he's speaking of.
In what context? That in this context? Yes, I think so. Yeah.
And he certainly says that to him at least, whether you agree with him or not, or whether you understand it or not,
Yeah.
he says that that liability comes within the 111th section. You agree that he says that?
Thus far, yeah.
And he then says, and that's the case, whether or not Canada can then claim that the lands in question are under the 109th section in any way for the satisfaction of that. Agree with me that he says that, right?
I agree that that's what he says. Yes.
Okay, thank you. So one of the things that I wanted to talk about next was the capitalization of the pre-augmented annuities.
And by that, sorry, you mean at the time of Confederation?
Well, that's what I want to talk about,
Oh,
actually.
okay.
You're reading my mind,
Okay.
Professor. I want to talk about the capitalization of what is variously called the perpetual annuities or the base or the fixed. If I use all of those terms, will you agree with me that I'm talking about the 500 pounds and the 600 pounds?
Yes, I kind of prefer fixed just because that's the
try to
language I'm
use that
accustomed to hearing, just so I'm clear. Yeah.
Okay, I'll try to use fixed then.
Yeah.
Okay. So I recall a question, I think it was yesterday, from Her Honor asking when these annuities were actually capitalized,
Hmm.
and you said you weren't quite sure. Do you remember that exchange?
I do remember that.
If I suggested to you that they were actually capitalized for the first time on July the 1st, 1869, would you agree with me on that?
I don't know.
Okay. So I'm going to take you through some documents that I hope you can help me demonstrate that that's the case. Partly because there's some other evidence to come about Indian trust accounts and whatnot. So go through it a little bit, okay? You're familiar with the name John Langton?
Yes, I'm trying to remember his exact role was Auditor General, is that
I was
correct?
going to say, my understanding is that he served as Canada's first Auditor General
Okay,
from the time of
yes,
Confederation until his retirement in
Yes.
September 1878, I believe.
Okay, yes,
Would you agree with me on that?
I would.
Okay. And immediately after Confederation, would you agree with me, or do you have an understanding that the Auditor General and his department, if I can put it that way, they were tasked with figuring out the accounts of the different colonies that had now united? Would you agree with that?
Yes, I think that's correct.
Okay. And of course, one of the reasons to do this was because the UPC account had to be figured out in order that Canada could charge interest on excess debt. Would you agree with that?
Okay, I'm sorry, just, can you repeat that for me?
Sure thing. One of the reasons it was so important to figure out the UPC account in particular
Mhm.
was because Canada had the right to be indemnified for interest over a certain amount. So they could charge interest to the UPC account, but they needed to figure out the excess debt to charge it on. Would you agree with that?
Well, I would say that would be true of all the colonies, not merely the province of Canada, that whether they were paying interest or charging interest, they needed to know the figures.
Fair enough, but only the UPC was being charged interest because of Section 112. That's right, isn't it?
Because of Section 112? Yes.
I don't recall anything
Yeah.
else in the Constitution about the other ones being charged interest. They were being given interest because they didn't have the debt. Isn't that right?
Not exactly, no. They would be, I don't know what their debt figures were at the time of actual entry into Confederation. But the understanding was that if their debt fell for New Brunswick below 7 million, they would receive interest. If it was above 7 million, they would pay interest. In the case of Nova Scotia, the figure was 8 million. So I don't know at this moment what their actual debt was at the time of entry. I know that at the time of the Confederation discussions in 1864, it was contemplated that they would receive interest. But of course, we know that actual amount of indebtedness had changed by the actual date of Confederation.
That's helpful. Thank you. Back to the point about this weirdness of the timing of the capitalization of those fixed annuities, those base annuities. If we turn to tab 4 in Ontario's compendium, now, I think this is a document that you referred to in your report. I appreciate it's one of many, many. Do you
Yes.
recognize it?
In this moment, no, to be honest, but I would accept that I probably looked at it and probably referred to it.
So this is, if I can describe it for the record, and please jump in if I misstate it. This is from the sessional papers, and it purports to be the public accounts of the Dominion of Canada for the fiscal year ended 30th June 1868. Do I have that right? That's on the first page.
Yes.
And then if we turn 3 pages in, and now I'm at page 38 of the compendium, we see report, if I may call it that. Goes on for quite some length.
Yes.
At page 43, I suggest to you that it's been signed or typed out by John Langton.
Yes.
And this is a report of the Board of Audit dated April 21, 1869 to the Honorable John Rose.
Rose, yes, he was the finance
Who's
minister
the
at
finance
this
minister
time.
of,
Yeah.
of the Dominion.
Correct.
All right. So in this report, I suggest to you that he's setting out what he's doing with the accounts for this year end. And the portion that you referred to in your report is at page 44. Maybe we can turn that up.
Page 44 of,
Excuse me, the compendium.
okay,
Professor Messamore.
yes.
And we have here a table of sorts. It's called along the top number 6. And it's entitled Statement Showing. I
Yeah,
think
no,
it-
shoeing was the idiom, yeah.
The capitalization at 5% of certain annual payments secured by the legislation of the late provinces, which are to be charged against them as part of their debt.
Yes,
And then at the bottom of the page, this notes that it's from the Audit Office, Ottawa, February 1869. You agree with me on that?
yes,
And then looking at the top portion of that table. And yeah, there we go. So here we have the province of Canada. So this is capitalization of certain payments for the province of Canada. You agree with me?
yes,
And we have Indian annuities under civil list.
yes.
And that's that number, that 26,664 you talked about on Friday?
The thing that we called the old annuities, yes,
Yeah.
or I think Jones referred to as the civil list annuities, which I thought was a
I
good.
thought
phrase.
that was
Yeah.
good language. I remember
Yeah.
you saying.
Yeah.
Okay. So there, John Langton then, this is about a proposal, he says, which are to be charged prospectively about the capitalization. So he figures that out and it's $533,280.
Mhm.
I'll trust his
Yes.
math on that. I've not figured it out. Then we see DO, I take it that's ditto.
Correct,
So I'm going to say Indian Annuities LC with a statute reference there for $4,000.
yes. So that's Lower Canada,
Right.
those 1851 annuities.
That's what you were talking about, that the Quebec government, or well, what's now the Quebec government, let me be more specific, the UPC had been giving to Indians in Lower Canada.
Correct,
And we see then that it's proposed to be capitalized at $80,000.
yes,
And then ditto again, Indian Annuities, Upper Canada annual vote. Can you tell us what that one is?
that one is the Robinson Treaties, 4,400 annually.
And then so that's the 88,000, that number has been tossed around a lot the last 2 days. It's pretty significant, right?
Yes,
And so we have total Indian annuities of $701,280. And then if we scroll down to the bottom of the page, we see that Mr. Langton is also proposing that pensions, annuities for pensions be capitalized. Would you agree with that?
yes,
And there's a $208,000 amount, and he gives a grand total of about $1 million, $999,835.55
yes,
is going to be capitalized.
yes,
At the top of the page, when we talked about what the table title said, you agree with me that he's talking prospectively at the time of this report, which are to be charged?
prospectively, which are to be charged.
Well, he's talking
Charged
about what he's going
against
to
them
do.
as part of their debt. I suppose the question is always with financial statements, what will be the date of the transaction, right? So that I suggested I don't know. Although I guess it would have been dated to the 1st of July, 1867.
Well, we're not in 1867. This
We're,
is,
yes, I understand that, but my point being that typically
yes, the beginning
they
of the
could be
fiscal year.
backdated and dated as of a certain date. Right?
Okay, well,
Yeah.
we'll come to that.
Okay,
But as of this point, Langton is suggesting something that's going to happen. Would you agree with me on that?
I think that would be accurate.
Okay. And in fact, the statements of account for the Secretary of State actually track when the annuities were capitalized in the Indian accounts themselves. So I'd like to look at this. If you turn to tab 5. Maybe I can pause here. Who do you understand to be the Secretary of State for Canada? What's that equivalent to? today. Would you be able to tell us that?
I think, if I'm not mistaken, this would later become Minister of Interior.
That's my understanding.
Yeah,
We see sometimes references to people in the Ministry of the Interior, Ministry of the Interior. I think Meredith was one of them.
no, he was a deputy minister.
He was, but in the Ministry of the Interior. Is that right?
Yes, I think, yes, that's correct, yeah.
So, I mean, the Secretary of State, that's the same department. It becomes something different.
Okay, yes.
Governments are really big on changing department names.
And when you speak of Canada, are we talking Dominion or UPC?
Well, this is after Confederation. So this is the Secretary of State of Canada. Professor Messamore, would you agree
Yes,
with me on
that is correct. Yeah, it refers to the Dominion.
Thank you.
So I'm at tab 5, and this is, I'm sure you'll agree with me from the cover page, a report of the Secretary of State of Canada for the year ending 30th June 1869.
Yes.
And then at page 50 of the compendium, we have a letter here dated November the 1st, 1869. Part of the, sort of in a similar vein, things being reported after the fiscal year has ended. We see that it's signed by W.M. Sprague. It's William Sprague, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
And he's the Deputy Superintendent of Indian Affairs, is he not?
Yes, he is.
So he's saying at this very first paragraph on page 50, reporting to the Secretary of State, no, excuse me, reporting to the Superintendent General of Indian Affairs and Secretary of State.
Yes.
Sir, I have the honor to lay before you the detailed statements in the usual form exhibiting the operations of the branch of the public service under your charge, connected with Indian affairs during the year commencing 1st July 1868 and terminating 30th June 1869.
Okay, yes, that's correct.
So then what we have here is the actual count. If we turn to page, it's page 53. It's the second last page of this tab.
Yes.
Have you seen a document like this before, Professor Messamore?
Yes.
Can you tell us what you understand it to be?
It's a statement of receipts and expenditure as shown in Indian books of the several tribes and funds during the year ending July 30th, 1869, and showing the balance of the several accounts at the commencement and close of the year.
Thank you. And then if we go down in the first column on the left, it says tribes or fund.
Mhm.
And about 10 down, do you see where it says Ojibwas of Lake Superior?
Yes, I do.
Would you agree with me that those are the Robinson Superior Anishinaabe?
Yes, I would.
And then a couple of columns over, we see something that says annuities and grants. You see that?
Yes, I do.
And then there's an amount here of $1,898.50. And it seems to me that they are putting money in and taking money out. There's a disbursements. And then there's an ultimate credit balance on the 30th of June, 1869 of $72.10. Do you agree with me on that?
Yes.
So I understand that this is tracking money that is being listed in various Indian accounts. And this is money that would be taken from the CRF of Canada at this point to pay annuities. Would you
So
understand
taken
that?
from the,
Canada's CRF, Consolidated
oh, I
Revenue
see,
Fund,
I
to
see.
pay the Indians each year for their annuities.
I should clarify that I'm not an expert on the mechanism through which all this happened.
Okay,
So I don't want to venture
Okay.
into speculation on that.
okay. You agree with me that there's a credit balance at the end of that year at $72.10?
Yes, I do.
Okay, and then if we look at the next page really quickly, we see another 10 line items down or so on the left-hand
Mhm.
side. We
Yes,
see the Ojibwas of Lake Huron.
yes, I do.
You agree with me that that's the Robinson Huron Anishinaabe
Uh,
peoples?
Yes, I would.
And then in the annuity line here, we see a credit being given for $2,400.
Yes,
And then we ultimately have a balance at the end of that year of $147.37.
yes.
But then if we turn to the next tab, this is the report of the very next year.
I wouldn't mind if you two would give me a chance to see this and turn pages.
Right.
Thank you.
If we turn to tab 6,
Yes.
Professor Messamore, I understand this to be the same sort of document that we just looked at, a report of the Secretary of State for Canada, but now for the fiscal year ending the 30th of June, 1869. Would you agree with that?
I'm sorry, it seems to say 30th of June, 1870.
Oh, I'm sorry, did I say 1869? I apologize.
Yeah,
I don't mean to mislead you. Yes, I mean for it to be the 30th of June, 1870.
yes,
Okay. So then we see here, we look at the last, I think it's the last page of this tab, page 58. This is a similar statement as we saw before, but here we see about 4 or 5 lines down. It looks like the Ojibwas of Lake Huron and then ditto Ojibwas of Superior are together. Do you see that?
yes, I do.
And then now under the credit balances, just a year later, we see $48,147.37 for the Huron. Do you see that?
Yes, I do.
And for the Superior, $40,072.10 for the Superior.
Yes,
And then we see a notation at the very bottom, signed by the accountant in Indian Affairs. The above total balances include the capitalization of the annuities.
yes,
Will account for the seemingly large increase of Indian funds.
yes,
So if I suggest to you that those credit balances that are now there listed of the 1st July 1869, those include now capitalized amounts for those annuities, plus the credit balance that existed at the end of the last fiscal year. Would you agree with that?
yes, I would.
Okay. So-
I was just wondering about that 1st of July, 1869. So
I think if we look at the last tab, we see that there was at the end of the fiscal year, which was June 30th, 1869.
yes,
That's where I was at tab 5. We see credit balance. I'm at page 53, Your Honor, for the Superior
okay,
of the compendium.
yes,
Page 53, we see a credit balance, the very last column before remarks. It says 30th June, 1869.
okay,
So that's the end of the fiscal. And there's $72.10. But then if we turn to page 58, now we've got the statement for the next fiscal.
of
58.
40,000.
right? So what happens is the very next day, credit balance, we've gone from the 30th of June, 1869 at the previous tab
Mhm.
to the very next day, the beginning of the new fiscal, the 1st July, 1869.
Oh, there it is. I was wondering.
It's very thinly highlighted. We were having printer problems to say the least.
Thank you.
But so now we see a bump. You'd
Yes.
agree with me, I think, Professor Messamore, that this is showing between these numbers and the statement by the accountant at Indian Affairs at the bottom of the page. This is representing that the capitalizations now appear in the Indian fund accounts. Is that right?
Yes, yes.
And so, Your Honor, I've spent some time on this because I recall a question that you had yesterday about when did this happen?
Thank you.
Okay. Okay. So one of the things that you talked about in the last couple days, I think it was yesterday, was about Deputy Minister Courtney and work that he was doing to recast accounts in the 1880s. Do you recall that
Yes, I
discussion
do.
with your counsel?
Yes.
Okay. So I want to talk a little bit more about that and to put some of it into perhaps some historical context. So if we could turn to tab 8 of our compendium. This is Exhibit 2000 in your documents. And I appreciate there's a lot of documents. I won't ask you to write a test on it. But if we look at the bottom right hand side of page 88 of the compendium. Okay, thank you. So this is a memorandum without prejudice. And if we skip to the next page, skip in your hard copy, on the top right-hand side, top left-hand side, excuse me, we see that the memo appears to be from a Mr. Wood and a Mr. Wurtle. Who were they?
The treasurer of Ontario and Quebec respectively.
And this seems to be dated the 23rd of November, 1882.
Yes, I think that's correct.
And if we can go back to that bottom right passage on page 88. It says, the treasurers of the provinces of Ontario and Quebec, having met to discuss the subject of a settlement of accounts between the two provinces and the Dominion, are of opinion that before proceeding thereto, it is expedient that a statement of accounts between the Dominion and each of the two provinces should be prepared. And then he goes on to talk about how he wants it, right?
Yes.
Okay. And then on the next page, the top of the page, the last paragraph before their signatures or their names, it says the treasurers, oh, wrong page, or right page, but up towards the top. Thank you. It's not highlighted, but it's the first full paragraph above their names, Professor Messamore. It says the treasurers therefore beg to request that such a statement be prepared and furnish them at an early date, and that all special funds be carried to the credit of the province to which they respectively appertain, as on the 1st July, 1867. Okay. Now, I recall yesterday that we were looking at a memo of Lawrence Van Coonet to Sir John A. Macdonald, and it was December 1882. Do you remember that?
I would need to see what memo in particular this was.
Okay.
Can you give me a,
I can. Tab 7.
oh, okay, I was thinking, I referred to this in
You
my
did, yeah.
report. That would be helpful, and then I could see the context in which I referred to it. Do you know
Absolutely.
what page on
If
my
we go
report I referred
to-
to it?
I can try to find it in your slides, but if we go to, I think it's at 190 of your slides.
I'm actually looking at the report itself because the slides are, of course, briefer. So if I want to understand the context for any memo, it might be helpful to see it where it appears in the report.
Okay.
So that,
Would this be on? Oh, okay. I was going to say 110 is my report. No, 111. Okay, yeah. And the slide. Okay, I think I found where we're at here.
You've repositioned yourself.
Yep.
Okay. So in your report, maybe to go back even a little bit more, under the heading in your report, it might be on the page previous, it says Dominion makes adjustment to Province of Canada debt account for arrears under Robson Treaty, and you give the date 1882.
Yes.
You talk about on November 23rd, 1882, a conference was held. And all I was going to suggest was that what we have next is information going from Van Coonet, Mr. Van Coonet, Deputy Minister, Deputy Superintendent General, to Sir John A. Macdonald the next month in the document that is at page 83 behind tab 7 of Ontario's compendium.
I'm pretty much lost. But
Okay, let me back up. I apologize. So I think Professor Messamore has looked at her report to refresh her memory.
yes,
And I am at Ontario's compendium, tab 7, Your Honor,
yes.
and I'm at page 83.
Did we move from 89 to 83 somehow? Okay,
We've moved back in time. We moved back in tabs. It would be lovely if all of these correspondence was in one document chronologically. I have not
Okay.
found that that's the case.
Okay.
So this is what I believe you were talking about in part yesterday. It's a memo from Mr. Van Coonet to the Right Honorable Sir John A. Macdonald.
Yes, that's correct.
And it's dated a month after the without prejudice of memo of the treasurers. You agree with me?
Okay. All right. Yes.
And that's the memorandum where they were asking for statements of account to be drawn up. As they said, they had met to discuss the subject of a settlement of accounts between the two provinces and the Dominion.
Yes.
So if you read this document, and I know you have, but I appreciate not recently, perhaps, Van Coonet appears to be reporting to Sir John A. Macdonald, who was, of course, not just the Prime Minister, I understand, but he was also acting in the capacity of.
Superintendent General of Indian Affairs. Yes.
So this is what we would think of as the deputy reporting to the minister. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
So he's reporting, Mr. Van Coonet is reporting to Sir John A. Macdonald about decisions that Mr. Courtney seems to have made Would you agree with that?
Yes. Maybe decisions isn't entirely the right word,
What
maybe
word would you use?
perhaps recommendations or his assessment of the situation. I would suggest that Courtney was not the one ultimately making the final decisions.
Fair enough. I like that. Recommendations or assessments. So get into what lawyers would call hearsay, but I'm going to work on the document. We have Van Kunet reporting to McDonald about Courtney.
Correct.
Right?
Yeah.
And then it gets even more complicated because we see references to Langdon.
Yes.
But there's no real magic here. At least Mr. Van Kunet is referring to reports that have or accounts that are being made up.
Yes.
And he says, sort of in the middle of this block on page 83, the treasurers of Ontario and Quebec have asked for a statement of affairs based on the award. You see that?
Yeah, I mean, I should qualify it and say that Van Kunet is reporting that Courtney has said this rather than.
I meant to
Yeah,
suggest that.
yeah, yes,
That's what I meant by hearsay. was
Right,
that
I
somebody saying
understand.
what somebody else said.
yes, yeah.
Sorry,
So,
Courtney has said that the treasurers have,
yes,
Okay.
Asked for a statement of affairs based on the award.
Deputy Van Kunet is reporting to the Prime Minister and John A. Macdonald that Mr. Courtney has said that the treasurers of Ontario and Quebec have asked for a statement of affairs based on the award. And I'm just going to pause there. And would you agree with me that at this point in time, 1882, the award that they are referencing is the award of 1870? In fact, the next sentence talks about the first sentence of the award proportions the excess debt.
Yeah, so this particular part of it refers to the debt of 1870 between Ontario and Quebec. The first section of the award proportions the excess debt of the old province of Canada as on the 30th of June, 1867. Is that what you mean?
They're
Yes.
asking for a statement. Courtney is telling McDonald, excuse me, Van Kunet is relaying to McDonald that Courtney is aware that the treasurers of Ontario and Quebec have asked for a statement of affairs based on the award. And I'm suggesting too that that's the award of 1870.
Oh, I see. Yes, yes.
And I'm also going to suggest to you that the fact that the treasurers of Ontario and Quebec have asked for a statement of affairs, that's a reference to that memo we looked at of a month earlier where they're asking for a statement of account. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I think so. Yeah.
And then Kunet goes on to say that it's necessary to find the excess debt.
Yes.
They're trying to figure out what those amounts are. Is that correct?
Well, actually, I recall finding that a bit cryptic, find the excess debt. I wasn't entirely sure what was meant by that. It would seem reasonable to assume that what they meant was calculate the excess debt, but I can't be certain about that.
I also think that that's what they're doing. They're calculating it. And they're talking about the arrears of annuity. You mentioned that yesterday in your testimony, this memo from Van Kunet about Courtney. It starts off, in fact, talking about a memorandum for the Lake Huron and Superior claims to arrears of annuity.
Yes.
So I think I would suggest to you that part of the excess debt might be those arrears that they need to calculate.
Yes.
Okay. And then we see as well that Van Kunet says again about Courtney, bottom of the page, and I'm quoting here, believing the claim, I take it that that's the claim for arrears. Do you agree with that?
Yes. Believing the
Believing-
claim to be valid, yes, yeah.
Believing the claim for arrears to be one which the government, that's the government of Canada,
I think so, yeah.
considers to be valid, the Deputy Minister of Finance, Courtney, in the Statement of Affairs, has charged the old province of Canada as on the 30th June 1867 with arrears and interest due to the Indians before Confederation. See that?
Yes, I do.
And then you actually took us to the next passage, I believe, where he goes on, Mr. Van Coonet, again, speaking about Deputy Minister Courtney. The Deputy Minister has a doubt as regards the accruals since Confederation, but he has nevertheless capitalized the annuities as on the 30th June 1867 and charged the amount to the province of Canada, that course being in accordance with section 13 of the award and being also in accordance with the course pursued in respect of other Indian annuities. See that?
I do see that, yeah.
And then finally, well, let me pause there. Section 13 of the award, I'm sure you'd agree, we're still talking about the award of 1870. Is that right?
We were talking about the Board of 1870.
And then he goes on, Mr. Langton, John Langton, is unable at this distance of time to say why a course was pursued with regard to other annuities and omitted so far as the Robinson annuities were concerned. Do you see that?
As far as the Robinson treaties were concerned, yes, I see that.
So I suggest to you that this whole memo gets a little confusing here, and that the reference to Langton is not about the base annuities, but rather the capitalization of arrears or new amounts that had been paid since 1875. Would you agree with that?
Mr. Langton is unable at this distance of time to say why such a course. I'm not quite sure what view he's attributing to Langton here. It sounds almost as though Langton thought that the Robinson Treaty annuities were not capitalized at all, but I'm not quite sure what this means.
Well, it confused me because for the reasons why we've already seen, Langton was very involved in the capitalization of the base annuities, right?
Oh, yes, I see. Yeah.
So I think at this point in time, this is 1882.
Yes,
Canada began paying $4 in 1875.
yes.
So I think, and again, there's probably some broken telephone here, but if they're
Mm.
talking about annuities being capitalized, it's not the base, that had already been done. It's $4 that they need to talk about at this point.
Perhaps that would be conjecture. I think it would be reasonable, but I wouldn't necessarily want to make that assertion without some evidence.
Well, I do think we have some evidence. You actually referred to it as well. If we look at page 64 and 65 of tab 7,
Mm.
page 64, we see a letter dated September 11th, 1877.
Yes,
And it's signed on the next page by John Langton, auditor. Do you see that?
yes, I do.
Are you familiar with this? Do you
Yes,
remember this at all?
Yes, I looked at this letter.
Okay. So you might remember then.
Sorry, this is 64 of your compendium.
Page 64, tab 7 of Ontario's compendium.
Thank you.
So this is a letter, says, "My dear sir," it seems to be have been sent rather to E.A. Meredith.
Yes,
And remind me who Mr. Meredith was again?
Deputy Minister of the Interior.
Of Canada.
Yes, I'm sorry, yes.
So we see Langton starting off his letter. He's speaking of the Lake Huron Indians in particular, but he says that he's been engaging and looking into our accounts with Ontario, and he's examined the Robinson Treaty. Do you see that?
Yes, I do.
And then he says at the very first numerated point, 1, is it intended to go into the question of arrears at all?
Yes,
And then he says, if we're responsible for arrears, the following facts should be at once ascertained.
yes.
And he talks about the net proceeds of the land and what years the annual receipts exceeded the amount of $4 per head. Do you see that?
Yes, I do.
So I made the connection looking at Van Kunit's memo that Mr. Langton had made inquiries about a capitalization for $4. Would you agree with me that that seems to be the connection here based on this letter that Mr. Langton had been inquiring about what he should do about this $4 arrear issue?
Well, again, I think it's unclear because he says that the 11,000, which has been voted for the last 2 years, only professes to be an approximation. And before we can legitimately charge Ontario with the amount, should the court hold them responsible, we must not have an approximation authorized, but the sums actually paid or payable. So it would seem to me that before it could be capitalized, you'd need to know how much to capitalize. So I'm not confident that Langton is referring to the capitalization of these arrears. It may be so, but I don't know that.
Well, in one of the paragraphs above, he asks, and I suggest that he's saying it's another one of the matters that he needs his attention to. What was the number of Indians year by year who were entitled to receive the annuities?
Yes,
I think, particularly as an accountant, he's very cognizant of having to apply numbers. I think you're right on that.
Mhm.
But I see the very last sentence of this letter. He's made these suggestions and he said, this is the information I need in order to proceed with the arrears calculation. But he says the only other course which could be followed would be a revised treaty to which Ontario should be a party, or, which would be the best, an agreement with Ontario as to a definite sum chargeable to it annually, irrespective of the actual annual cost. You see that?
yes, yes.
Okay. So whatever they were talking about capitalizing, though, it seems to have caused a bit of confusion, perhaps with Mr. Courtney and Mr. Van Kunit, because Mr. Courtney does do a capitalization for all amounts, isn't that right?
At what point? I'm sorry. Can you fill that in for me more?
I was trying not to jump around, but it's too complicated not to, right? So if we go back to, let's see where we were, tab 7 of the compendium,
Yes.
and we go back to page 84. And after that paragraph about Mr. Langton in the middle of the page, we see Mr. Van Kunit reporting to the Prime Minister, as regards the alleged omission, he's talking about this omission that people thought Langton had. It is, however, proper to remark that to meet the payments under the Robinson Treaty,
Yes.
a sum of $98,000 was capitalized and it is, the interest on that sum, these namely $4,400 a year, which has been divided among the Indians at rates varying from $1.66 to $1 per capita from 1851 to the time when the first parliamentary grant in 1875 enabled the department to increase the annuities from $1 to $4 per capita. You see that?
Yeah, so that suggests, as I understand it, that Courtney believes Langton was referring to the original capitalization. He said 98,000, but in point of fact, it was 88,000, which was required to capitalize the Robinson and Lower Canadian treaties.
So I think well, there's a couple of things. The first thing is, can we agree that the $98,000 is an error or typo?
That's my inference, yeah, that it was 88,000 that was meant.
And my understanding from the record, and indeed from some of the items that we've looked at already, is that what Courtney was doing here, or what Van Kunit was saying, reporting that Courtney had done, was essentially recapitalize or rebook a capitalization for the Robinson annuities against the UPC account.
That is my recollection as of 1882 that he did that.
Yeah.
Yes.
So
yeah.
he's
You'll-
double booked it.
Yeah,
Yes.
That's what
It
you
had
mean
already
by
been done.
rebooking?
Yes, and that error was remarked upon
Yeah.
right away. Yeah.
right away, exactly.
Yes, yeah.
So in fact, as you talked about yesterday, Treasurer Ross in particular,
Yes.
I may put it this way, was all over that.
Yes, absolutely.
All right, if we turn then to tab 8, I'm just wondering about our time. I'm wondering if I can get through this section. Are we okay to do a few more pages if the
I am,
recorder is?
yes, thank you.
Okay. If we look at tab 7 and we turn to page 64. Oh. I'm in the wrong. Tab 7, 64. That was Langton. Sorry, excuse me a moment. I'm going to move ahead to tab 8 and page 89 of the compendium. So if we look at page 89, and we look at the bottom of the left-hand side, we'll see that this is immediately after that memorandum from the treasurers of Ontario and Quebec, where they had requested the accounts be done so that they could move forward with a settlement of account. And we have here what's a report or a memo that's dated from J.M. Courtney, Deputy Minister of Finance, on June the 1st, 1883. Do you see that?
Yeah, I believe it's June 21st is what I read.
Oh, your eyes are better than mine. Yes, June 21st. And then there's a highlighted portion on the screen,
Yes.
and we see that he's talking about Mr. Langdon adjusting accounts before his retirement. And then in the sidebarred section that's not highlighted, it says, it will be observed in the memorandum prepared by the treasurers of Quebec and Ontario.
Could you let me find that, please?
Of course, it's on the bottom left of the
Got it, thank
the
you.
page.
Yes.
It's sidebarred, Your Honor.
Thank you.
And I'm reading from it that begins, it will.
Yes, thank you.
It will be observed in the memorandum prepared by the treasurers of Quebec and Ontario in November 1882, that they desired the accounts to be made up in a special form starting from the date of Confederation, giving each province credit for the trust funds which belong to it, and charging or crediting the interest half yearly. I have therefore, in accordance with this request, thoroughly revised the accounts from their commencement and calculated the interest in the manner suggested.
Yes.
And so then what follows, it seems, are the statements. And then if we go to tab 91,
So page 91.
page 91 of tab 8 still. We see a schedule from the province of Canada. In the top left shows July 1st, 1867. Please zoom out a bit. There we go. You see that?
Yes, is there a particular part of it you wanted to?
Well, I was just,
Mhm.
this is the, so
Oh, the
Courtney has
date
said
that
that
it's-
he's
yeah, July.
redoing these accounts
Yes,
as of
July.
July the 1st,
Sorry,
1867. Mr. Courtney has said in the memo we just looked at that he's redoing all of these accounts as of July the 1st, 1867.
Yes,
And it's my belief, I'm asking if it's yours as well, that this is something that Mr. Courtney has done. It's the statements that he's preparing.
yes.
And then if we look towards the left-hand side, towards the bottom of the page, there's some highlighting that we've done. And we see first, capitalization of annuities, $999,835.55. Do you see that?
Yes, I do.
Would you agree with me that that's that initial capitalization that included all of the Indian annuities that Mr. Langton had done?
That is correct.
And then we have at the bottom of the page, some more capitalizations. Those are the numbers that Mr. Courtney and Mr. Van Coonet were doing, or Mr. Courtney, I guess, was doing in 1882. Arrears of payments to Indians under Robinson Treaty, 140,800. See that?
Yes, I do. Yeah.
And capitalization of annuities, it's really hard. I think it's $303,280.
Yeah, I believe so.
And then, everybody a minute to catch up. Still in the
So where
same-
did we get to after? So I'm seeing as a last line on the left-hand column, capitalization of annuities, 902,000.
I think that's 300.
Oh, 300.
Those are the numbers that corresponded with Mr. Van Coonet's memo, setting out Mr. Courtney's figures that Van Coonet was sending to Sir John A. Macdonald.
I feel like I'm doing a test at the optometrist.
We'll all be forensic accountants at the end of the day.
Or blind.
Some of us already are.
So, okay, so that's the line you brought to the attention of the witness. And you said this is a capitalization that Mr. Langton has done. The witness agreed.
The 999,000 was what Langton had done, which had included the Robinson annuities. Isn't that right?
Originally in
Yeah.
in 1869, yes.
So this is just demonstrating that Mr. Courtney, and I think you and I both agree, Professor Messamore, that he had made a mistake and he was now recapitalizing.
Same amount, yes.
Okay. And as I suggested to you, we'll get to the fact that Mr. Ross was certainly quick to point it out. But if we turn to page 93 of the compendium, we have a lot of correspondence beginning in 1883 that's going back and forth. First, it's set out with Quebec and Mr. Courtney. And then on page 94, there's the correspondence between Ontario and Mr. Courtney. I don't think we need to go into each of them, but if you want to look at them, I think you'll agree with me that it's fair to say that those treasurers, having asked for statements of account, are following up with Mr. Courtney and saying, may we please have them? We would like to move forward with the settlement of accounts. Do you agree with that?
Yes, I think that's accurate.
And then to both Ontario and Quebec, they are finally sent on the 17th December 1883. And we see for the Ontario instance that that's at page 96. The left-hand side, the Courtney writes to the honorary treasurer in Toronto saying, "Sir, I have the honor to enclose herewith printed copy of accounts between the Dominion, the late province of Canada, and the provinces of Ontario and Quebec."
Yes.
So they got what they asked for, right?
Yes.
Go to tab 7 and page 76 of the compendium.
Everything okay?
Almost done this section. This is a letter dated February the 4th, 1884. And it's from Mr. Ross to Mr. Courtney. Do you agree with that?
Yes, the highlighted letter. Yes, Ross to Courtney. Yeah.
And if you can take a look at that and tell me if you agree that it seems that Mr. Ross, having received those statements in late December 1883, he's now maybe had a chance to review them, and he's asking for an explanation from Mr. Courtney for that capitalization that had been added. Do you agree with that?
Yes, he's asking for an explanation of both charges, the arrears and the capitalization. Yes.
And he says in that second paragraph, he references the $999,835.55. And he points out that that already included Indian annuity capitalization, right? Well, he says that.
Yeah, he
number
says
was
that
made.
at some point, but I don't think he actually says it in this letter. As
I'm looking at the first page, Professor Messamore, page 76.
76, yes.
It's on the screen. It might be easier to read. It's so small. The second paragraph there. Treasurer Ross says, in the same page in the schedule, $999,835.55 is charged for capitalization of annuities, in which is included $701,280 of Indian annuities. I'm just suggesting to you that, in fact, he's pointing out to Courtney, this was already done.
I don't think he's doing that yet, actually. Maybe I'm misunderstanding, but I know he does do it. I'll certainly accept that and around this time, but I just don't know if this letter is the one that says it. He's
Okay.
asking for the explanation of 140,800 for the arrears and of the 303,280 capitalization of annuities. He's not been able to discover any such charge in the various statements of the debt of the late province of Canada. He, on the same page in the schedule, he says 999,835.55 is charged for capitalization of annuities, in which that was all annuities, of course, not merely the so-called Indian annuities, right?
That's
But of that 999 plus is included 701, is that 480 of Indian annuities. I should be obliged if you could direct me to any statements published showing what these arrears consist of, when they accrued and when they were unpaid, and what are the annuities payable by the late province, which are capitalized. So I don't think, it might be implicit in this, that if you do the arithmetic, you might say that some of this money has been counted twice, but there is another letter in which he says so explicitly.
Yeah, so let's turn to that one because it's a follow-up to Mr. Courtney that he makes, Treasurer Ross makes, dated June the 4th, 1884. And that's at page 79 of this book. Same tab, tab 7.
Yes. Yeah,
So,
so that's Ross to Courtney, yes.
yep. So here he's referring to a letter that it looks like he had received 8 ultimo. And I
Yeah,
believe
8
that
of the
means
previous
8
month, yeah,
previous month.
yeah.
And that's a couple page over where Mr. Courtney had on page 77. In fairness, I want you to see the whole context, but page 77, we see a letter from Courtney to Ross dated May the 8th. And he seems to be explaining in 3 paragraphs or so here what each of the numbers that Mr. Ross had complained about relate to. You see that?
I'm sorry, yeah, so we're now,
We're at page 77.
no, I'm just thinking of the date, March, April. March, April. So it seems to be 4 months later, the letter in which he actually specifies directly that they have in fact been charged twice. And am I right in that? I think
Well,
that's,
let's break it down so we don't
Yeah.
get too ahead of
yeah,
everybody else. And I don't think much turns on this, but Ross
No.
complains in February 4th. In a letter of May the 8th, Mr. Courtney says that he's answering the letters of the 4th and actually the 20th of February. I'm at page 77. So he's now providing, I would suggest to you, an explanation for the numbers that Mr. Ross had taken issue with.
yes, and to me, this seems to suggest that Courtney is not yet aware, is he, that the amount's been charged twice?
I don't think he's aware because
Yeah.
then we see, if we fast forward a little bit, a couple pages to that letter on page 79,
Yes,
dated June the 4th,
yes,
where we now have Mr. Ross going back to Mr. Courtney.
yes.
And I think it's fair to say that Mr. Ross is disputing Mr. Courtney's explanation.
Yes.
Sorry, I'm just wondering if we're just me. Whenever you're ready.
And then if we look at page 81, there's a highlighted block there. This is Mr. Ross's letter of June the 4th, 1884 to Mr. Courtney.
Yes. And so that, my point was simply, and again, I would agree that I don't know that anything turns on this either. I wouldn't know, but, my point was simply that it wasn't in that initial letter that Ross complained of the double counting of that capitalized amount. It was on this letter of June the 4th.
Okay, I thought it was implicit, but it's certainly in this letter very clear what Ross is saying, and that's that you've double charged us. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I would. I mean, if it's implicit, it seems that it went over Courtney's head, though.
And what page is that, the June 4th letter?
June 4th letter begins at 79, Your Honor,
Thank you.
and Professor Messamore and I are looking at a particular passage from that letter that is at page 81.
Thank you.
And there's a couple of things about Mr. Ross's response that is significant, I would suggest. He, of course, says that you've overlooked the fact that the annuities under these same treaties had already been capitalized, charged to the debt of the late province, and assumed by the Dominion in the sum of $88,000.
Yes,
And he lists what each of them are.
yes,
And he goes on, they form part of the $999,835.55 charged as capitalization of annuities.
yes.
And he references Dominion Session number 4, 1869, material number 6. I looked that up. It went to the table that John Langton had suggested, but I'm
Yes.
not going to test your memory.
No, I
think-
agree. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. This 88,000 was the amount which the annuities under these treaties were valued at and capitalized with the concurrence of both the provinces and the Dominion, and appeared at that sum in the statement of the debt furnished by the Dominion to the arbitrators in the settlement of the accounts between Ontario and Quebec.
Yes, this is what he says.
And of course, because the year we're in right now, 1884, the arbitrators, he's talking about the section 142 arbitrators, would you agree?
That's correct.
Thank you. And then he finishes, that I submit
Yes.
was a virtual settlement of the annuities and an assumption by the Dominion of the liability at the sum of $88,000. The Dominion running the risk of an increase or diminution of the amounts that might thereafter be claimed by or payable to the Indians. Do you see that?
Yes, I see that. Yeah.
Okay. So then, would you agree that for Ontario at least, very clear, I would suggest, that this issue of the idea of being double charged for the capitalization was important to be cleared up?
Well, certainly a mistake in the calculations had to be cleared up. I think that Ross puts a particular interpretation on what the capitalization meant in the initial calculations to create that fund, the capitalization. His interpretation is that that's final and that it could not be added to. That's something that he, one of his many arguments, I think, as to why he believes Ontario should not have been liable for it.
And we'll see that theme that capitalization was meant to be a settlement play out over a number of decades. But what I was really suggesting was that if this was going to be capitalized and charged to the UPC account again, the Dominion would be charging the UPC interest on it. Isn't that right?
I think that he's asking to have this mistake corrected, and any correction would carry with it the corresponding interest adjustment. I think that could be understood.
That's right.
Yeah.
And it was also, I suggest to you, an issue because the 88,000 that had been initially capitalized,
Yes,
okay, interest had been charged on that. Do you agree with me? From the point that it was capitalized?
interest had been charged on the excess debt of the province of Canada. So what precisely that excess debt consisted of is, I mean, you could say that it would be reflected in the amount of interest they were charged, if that's helpful.
And my understanding from the arbitration of 1870 and all of the events afterwards is that that was certainly part of the excess debt and money was being charged on it. But let's assume for a moment that that's the case without saying definitively that it was. If it was excess debt, interest would be charged. Is that correct?
Interest would be charged on excess debt. What that excess debt consists of, we wouldn't necessarily identify any one item and say that one was
Okay.
excess debt and the other was debt covered under the debt allowance, right? If that's helpful.
I think we're essentially saying the same thing.
Yes.
Perhaps
Yeah.
I'm not being as eloquent as I would like to.
Okay.
But in 1873, the debt allowance was increased, right?
That's correct. Yeah.
And that was an act of May 1873.
Yes, it was. Yeah.
And my understanding from reading that act is that it was made retroactive to January the 1st, 1873. Is that your recollection as well?
Yes, it was. Yeah.
And then my also understanding is that from that point, it cleared out the excess debt at the time as of 1873, and there was no interest being charged for a portion of time until more debts were found.
I don't think that's exactly an accurate way to look at it. I think all it means is that every province received an equal percentage increase, was it 16.8 something, I believe, in their debt allowance. And so that may have had the effect of clearing a province excess debt, but that wasn't understood to be the purpose of it. I
Okay,
think,
well,
yeah, sorry. And I would acknowledge, I think as I remember, the legislation might introduce some ambiguity about that point.
Well,
But
we might disagree on that.
Okay.
But I'm going to take you to a couple of documents that seem to me to be quite clear that the excess debt was abolished as of that point, right? So if we look at tab 8, and we go to page 90.
Yeah, I thought we were 2
Would you like to
pages.
stop at this point?
Yeah.
I'm happy to.
Right, yeah. Sorry.
Just don't apologize, just poke me.
We'll take 15 minutes.
All right. For recess for 15 minutes. Did you see that?
Your Honor, just on a point of housekeeping, I've been asked how long I think I might be today and when it might be a good time to stop. That's a very good question. I'm just looking at my notes and I have a couple of perhaps what I think will be short sections followed by a very long one. And I don't think we'll get through the long one. So because of that, I'm content to not try to push through it. It is quite long. Might I suggest that it's 5 to 4 right now?
Mhm.
If we stopped at about 45 minutes or so, would that be okay for everybody?
I'm very much in your hands. I don't know what it means for you getting through tomorrow as well. So, but if you think it works, that's fine.
Remind me about the discussion yesterday. Did we agree that we were going to start at 9 a.m. tomorrow? Is that another idea?
So
I think so. I think so.
Okay, then I think if we went for, 45 minutes or give or take a couple minutes right now, that would be fine and we'll
All right.
start.
Very good.
We all get tired too.
Yes, and I think the reporter's response was, it's one thing to add an hour at the beginning of the day, but then at the end, it should end pretty closer to the end of the day.
I am completely of that view as well.
Excellent. Okay, very good. And everyone can remind me, was Professor Messamore asked about her copyright?
I'm sorry, I neglected to do that.
Can happen anytime.
I can ask that question if that's appropriate. We back on then? Professor Messamore, one of the things that has been asked of all of the experts that have testified so far in this stage 3 of the trial is if they would waive any copyright to the reports that they've been preparing for this trial and that have been entered into the trial record as an exhibit. Do you agree to do that as well?
Yes, I do.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor. So when we broke, we were talking about the excess debt. And maybe we'll go back a bit as a bit of a recap.
Yes.
You had agreed with me that the Dominion had passed legislation in May 1873 that would increase the debt allowance for all of the provinces as they then were.
Yes,
And it had increased the debt allowance for the province of Canada.
yes,
Bit tricky because it had been split, but they did it for the province of Canada
yes,
in the amount of 10 million, roughly 506,000. Do you agree with that?
that's correct.
And I had suggested to you that my reading of the legislation made that retroactive to January the 1st. And I think you had agreed with that, January the 1st, 1873.
Yeah, I think that, I'm just trying to remember the details, but there was a later transaction to have that effect. I think the transaction was in 1884, so that interest would be recalculated based on that backdated transaction.
Yeah, that's
so-
a little bit different, I believe. We'll get to that too. I don't think we need to get into it. It would
Yeah, I
it
mean,
would be fine. My understanding, for what it's worth, is that they increased the debt allowance as of January the 1st, and they didn't do anything just yet about interest payments. Is that your understanding as well?
I would have to just verify that, but my understanding was that, that when they, yeah, the provinces made the claim that the adjustment should have been made retroactive so as to entitle the provinces to an interest adjustment backdated to the date of union. And in 1884, with new legislation, 47 Victoria, Chapter 4, the Dominion conceded this claim and authorized such an adjustment. So I would say there are two transactions, one to increase the debt allowance and another to
Yeah.
make it retroactive and
And
adjust interest accordingly.
yeah, and I think I can move on with it. The January 1st date, it's not hugely important, I don't think. I think there's two retroactive things going on. There's an act passed in May 1873 that by its term says that this will have effect as of January the 1st, and that's what I mean. So as of January the 1st, and Parliament does this sometimes, they say the act is passing now, but it's in effect as of a certain date,
I'm sorry, January 1st of what year?
1873.
Uh,
So
Oh,
1873.
retroactive in that
Yeah,
sense. I
retroactive just in
understand.
that sense. I'm not
Okay,
talking
I
about-
thought,
Not talking about
Okay.
recalculation of interest.
okay, I didn't remember that aspect
Yeah,
of
no,
the legislation,
and-
but
and
I'd
that's-
concede that point. Yeah.
That's fine. As I said, I don't think much turns on it, and I don't mean to use legal words. But then I'd said to you just before the break, I'd asked you if you agreed with me that as of that date and as of that bump in the UPC's debt allowance of about $10.5 million, that had the effect at the time it was done, whether it was January or May, at the time it was done, it had abolished the excess debt of the UPC as it was then understood to be as of that date. And I think you disagreed with me.
Well, I didn't exactly disagree. Maybe I would take issue with the word abolish. It might be misleading.
Okay,
It simply was an increase in the debt allowance, which was as you mentioned, a particular amount, 10,500,000, with an equivalent increase for every other province, which amounted to 16.81%. So my position is simply that it might have had the effect. I didn't actually verify the accounts to see, is the debt account sitting at zero at this point? And frankly, by the time that we know that debt accounts fluctuate as to their balance in the interval from the time the legislation was passed, naming a particular sum, there undoubtedly were other transactions. I don't know that, but my point is that the term abolish is misleading. It might have had that effect, but didn't necessarily have that effect.
I'm going to ask you to turn to tab 8 of Ontario's compendium,
Yes.
and in particular, page 90.
Tab 11.
No, excuse me, Your Honor, tab 8
Thank you.
and page 90.
Got it.
And there's some highlighting here. The left-hand side of the page, we have a letter. We have a letter from Mr. Langton. That's Mr. John Langton, the Dominion Auditor General.
Correct?
And it's going to the Premier of Ontario, O. Mowat,
Yes.
Oliver Mowat.
Yes.
And it's dated the 10th of September, 1877.
Yes.
And at this point in time, 1877, it's a few years after that increase of the debt allowance, right?
Yes.
And he is writing to the Premier and Attorney General of Ontario, and he's talking about accounts that he's going to prepare and enter to the end of the year, the fiscal year being June 30th, 1877. Do you see that?
Yes.
And then he talks about how he's doing this, and Common School Fund is a fund that comes up an awful lot.
Mhm.
And then he says, after the debt, however, was abolished in 1873, and he talks about paying the subsidy directly. You see that?
Yes, I do.
I'm going to suggest to you that certainly Mr. Langton, the main accountant for Canada, thought that the debt was being abolished in 1873.
Well,
And now those subsidies could be paid directly rather than have the interest charges deducting from the subsidy. Isn't that right?
so yeah, as I say, it may have had that effect, but that was not the what was specified in the legislation. I guess a good way to think of the debt account is a moving target, right? And so it might have happened to capture all of the existing debt, and thus you could say abolish it. He certainly uses that language, but it didn't mean that no additional debt could ever be added in adjustment or anything like that.
Well, I didn't suggest that. I
yeah,
said at
yeah.
that moment in time, it
Okay.
had abolished the excess debt.
Okay, that's,
Well-
I haven't confirmed.
Well, if you're asking, I'd like to know what you mean by it. If you're asking the witness to agree that it meant the debt was abolished, the witness was trying to give a meaning that she heard. If you're just asking if Langton said that, we have that.
Okay, my question, I thought my question to witness was initially that if she would agree that the excess debt that the UPC had as of 1873, when the debt allowance was increased, that excess debt was wiped out. It was wiped clean. As of that point in time, understanding that as new debt could be found, it might now be more excess, but the debt was wiped clean. The excess debt was wiped clean with the increase to the debt allowance.
Well, as I said, though, I haven't looked at the
You've not looked
account.
at it.
Langton says that that's so, or at least seems to.
Okay.
And, but I have not confirmed that that's so. I had no reason to do that.
Okay, and that's fine. I think there's one other confirmation in the document that you referred to. If we could turn to tab 2 of our compendium. Do you recognize this? It's a thesis that I
Yes,
believe that you've referred to in your report.
yes, I do recognize it.
And A.W. Boos, is he a historian?
I believe he's an economist.
That might make some good sense because he talks a lot about the financial deal at Confederation. And at page 26 of the compendium,
Page 26.
and still behind tab 2, this is the Boos dissertation
Yes,
that
yes.
you include in your report.
Yes.
Tab 26, you're on. I'm just then reading what I assume it's Mr. Boos.
Yes.
Mr. Booth says, he's talking about 1873. He says in 1873, in the same year, 1873, further readjustments were made in the financial relations of the provinces to the Dominion, this time in connection with debt allowances. Since 1867, the provinces were liable to the Dominion for the amount by which their respective debts exceeded their specified allotments. I take it he's talking about the debt allocation, their allotments,
The debt allowance, yes.
at the time of the Confederation, and had to pay interest in such excess. The old province of Canada had a surplus debt of $10,506, $500,088.84 over and above its allowed debt of 62,000, excuse me, I'm tired, 62,500,000. Ontario and Quebec experienced difficulty in arbitrating this portion of their public debt. And to relieve the situation, the federal government deemed it expedient to assume the interest charges on this excess amount of $10,506,88.84. The debt allowance of Ontario and Quebec was therefore fixed at $73,006,008.84. You see that?
Yes, yes.
So I think I read this, and you can tell me if you agree or not, that Mr. Booth is also suggesting that the federal government had assumed all of the interest charges. The debt allowance had been increased to the amount of the excess debt. Agree with that?
I agree that the federal government has agreed to increase the province of Canada debt allowance by this very specific amount, which evidently, I would accept, had the effect of reducing that excess debt to zero.
Okay, that's all I was looking for.
Yeah,
Now, you did mention that there was further legislation in 1884.
yes,
Okay. And that's the legislation that made that debt allowance retroactive to Confederation. Isn't that right?
yes, that's what I understand.
Yeah. And if we can turn to your report, actually. And I believe it's page 129, please. Are you there?
Yes, I am.
Okay, you have a heading here, adjustment to settle interest arrears stemming from the 1873 provincial debt allowance adjustment, 1884.
Yes.
John, are you there? Should I wait?
I'd like you to wait, thank you.
Page 129, you're on.
Thank you.
And it says, you write, in 1884, McDonald's government decided to settle the question of the long-sought interest adjustment stemming from the 1873 revision of provincial debt allowances. The April 1884 measure, to tell us the name of the act, was an adjustment to take account of interest charged to the provinces between 1 July 1867 and 1 January 1873 on excess debt. To continue, the interest that the Dominion had charged during this period on excess debt was added to the debt allowance, and interest on this amount at 5% up to 1 July 1884 also added to the debt allowance. This added $5,397,503.13 to the debt allowance of the province of Canada, to be divided between Ontario and Quebec according to the section 142 arbitration of 1870. And that's what you were talking about a minute, or maybe a
Yeah.
little longer than a minute ago, but when you were talking about the retroactiveness, that's what you're referring to. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So anything, if I understand it, anything then that had been charged up to that 73 million or so now, the bump, anything that had been charged for interest was now retroactively credited back to the UPC account. Do you agree with that?
Not exactly. What I would agree is that there would be an interest adjustment to reflect a new higher debt allowance. So there might perhaps have been things charged to the debt account in the interval that might have themselves attracted interest. So I guess my point is still the same, which is that the debt allowance, whether it's 62.5 million or a higher figure, is a hard line. It's a cap. It doesn't it might have the effect of covering all of the province's debt, but it's not a firm commitment that it will do so.
And that's not the question I asked you. The question I asked you was, to the extent that the debt allowance, that's 60, put it this way, the 62.5 that was in 112 of the British North America Act, section 112 of the British North America Act.
Yes,
It started with $62.5 million, right?
correct.
Okay. And then by the Act of May 1873,
Yes,
that amount gets increased, right?
yes, that's correct.
So in effect, we could look at section 112 of the British North America Act and maybe substitute that new number for the 62.5. Is that right?
Well, I mean, in practice, it wouldn't work that way, but that would be a good way to understand the debt allowance. It's no longer 62.5 million. It's a higher figure. And it's a higher figure proportionately for every other province. And I guess my point is that if we want to understand this well, it's useful to reflect that for every other province, it wouldn't necessarily have the effect of wiping out their debt or anything of the sort. It's just a proportionate increase in the debt allowance for everybody.
I think we can read it that way because
Yeah.
your own words say and describe the Act of 1884 says that 1873 bump was now retroactive to July the 1st, 1867.
Yes, correct. But of course, we don't change the BNA Act is sort of my point.
Well,
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
So let's see if I understand. So there was a debt allowance originally of 62.5 million.
That's correct.
In May 1883, that debt allowance was increased to 73 million for the UPC.
May 1873?
83, I thought I said.
Yeah, no,
1873.
1873.
Oh, okay,
The adjustment
1870.
was May 1873.
All right, let me get that fact again. In
And it-
1873, the
Mhm.
debt allowance for UPC was increased to 73 million.
Well, not exactly. It was increased to 73,506,000.
Okay, 0.5.
Yeah, okay.
I'm
Yeah.
always going to round.
Okay, good, fine.
500,000 here, 500,000 there. So It was increased,
It was.
so
For-
around
for-
73 million.
Yes, and for every.
So, but what we're talking about, that's
Mhm.
just the basics.
Yep.
What we were just talking about, I thought, through Ms. Barclay's question, and through your answers, was what happened to the interest that the UPC had paid on the excess debt over 62.5 million,
Yes,
and is part of the, as you call it, the bumping up of the debt allowance, was part of that legislation, that debt paid over the excess of 62.5 million to the new debt allowance of 73 million. Was that somehow credited back to UPC?
not necessarily.
Was there some adjustment made for it?
What the adjustment was to, I guess I just feel that it's important to understand that these adjustments weren't to be inferred as a blanket forgiveness of debt.
Okay,
And I think that it's important because this point comes up frequently in later discussions. And I think some of the actors involved implied that. But my position is that that's not the case, and I don't think it was ever treated as the case. So this is why I stress that in 1873, with this increased debt allowance for the province of Canada, there was an equal increase percentage-wise for every other province,
yes.
which in some cases might have covered their debt. Maybe it didn't, I didn't determine that. And I didn't
Different for every
consider-
province.
Exactly, yes. So in 1884, what happened is that 1873 debt allowance adjustment was backdated to 1867. And that would have an effect in recalculating all the interest the province had been charged in the interval.
Yes.
It didn't necessarily mean that they would have paid no interest on debt or anything like that. It's just a proportionate adjustment because of the.
Well,
backdating.
but proportionate, you're talking about different provinces. But for UPC,
Yeah,
what did it mean?
what it meant is that their debt account calculations would
Yes.
change to reflect the fact that now it's calculated as if they've always had that higher debt allowance.
But in fact, that's not just what happened though,
Oh,
right?
I'm just going to ask her to finish. I'm
Sorry,
quite
I
happy
thought she
to.
had.
Not finish with me. So treat it as if the debt allowance had always, as of 1867, had always been the 73 million.
Yes,
So that would mean on the, as you've used the word, the fluctuating basis, there's a credit now to UPC perhaps, as there are debits some days and credits for others, but that could be characterized as a credit.
yes, I think that,
Well, I'm
yes.
just trying to
Oh, I'm
establish,
sorry.
it wasn't ignored. The fact that they had paid interest,
oh no, it wasn't ignored, certainly.
it was taken into account.
It was taken into account.
The mechanics of how, I don't need to know.
Yeah.
It was
I-
taken into account. Is that a fair way to characterize what
Yes,
happened?
it is. Yeah, I suspect that what Ms. Barkley is going to refer to next, it was taken into account in a peculiar way.
Okay, that's okay. You
Uh,
wait for
okay,
her.
sorry.
for her to get back there. Now
I
you
was-
might have a question arising from. mine.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I was just so that we're clear, here's how I understand it. May 1873, everybody gets a bump.
Yes,
I acknowledge everybody gets a bump.
yes,
I'm talking just about the UPC.
okay,
The UPC's bump is, to round, about $10.5 million.
yes,
So that increases that amount that was set out in section 112
yes,
from 62.5 to roughly 73.
yes,
We agree on that. And then that meant, and I believe that as of that point of the bump, all of what was considered excess debt up to that point, 10.5, it sucked into the new debt allowance.
yeah, it would have been covered by the
That's
debt
right.
allowance, yes, yeah,
That's
fair
a better
enough.
way of putting
Yeah.
it than sucked in, thank you. But the provinces, I think, complained to Sir John A. Macdonald and said, well, hang on a second. You were charging us interest, but now you've agreed that our debt allowance is more. Please pay us back that interest. And my understanding from the documents I've read, but I think you very nicely put it in your own report, is that he capitulated. He agreed to pay back that interest. And you say here at page 129 of your report that when he did that, when the government did that, it added an additional amount of money to the province of Canada's debt allowance. It was paying back that interest previously paid.
Yeah, in this case, I relied on J.A. Maxwell, a publication called Federal Subsidies to the Provincial Accounts in Canada. And I will confess, I don't think, as I remember, that I particularly went back and examined the accounts based on Maxwell's point. I think what my takeaway from this is that there was a proportionate increase. Well, he said that that this was actually added to the debt allowance, is how he phrased it, as opposed to I'm sorry, the retroactive adjustment in 1884 was added to the debt allowance, and interest on this amount up to July 1st, 1884 was added to the debt allowance. So as I recall, he said something like they that way got interest on interest or something like that. And so the mechanics of the transaction, I will acknowledge, are a bit murky to me. I think what's, to me, the important thing that I thought was necessary to note is that the debt allowance remained consistent for all provinces. It was always a matter of precise calculation, and there was no point at which there was a general announcement that all your debt is forgiven. That's kind of my understanding of this.
Okay, I think we've agreed on the points we need to agree on.
Okay.
Okay. So I want to talk about sort of picking up from some of the conversation that we had. Can't even remember when, maybe before the lunch break, maybe before the afternoon break, about the arrears that were at this point in time, or at some point in time after the $4 increase in 1875 were starting to be calculated. And would you agree with me that in the course of these discussions of paying more to the annuitants than the base amount, that Ontario expressed its view early on that the province, in fact, had no further liability for Indian annuities under the Robinson treaties? Would you agree with that?
I'm sorry, I'm going to need you to repeat the part of that question. And I'm sorry, I have to confess, I was momentarily distracted because I said that I hadn't checked the accounts. I just glanced down on my report and see that in fact I did, and I have the numbers. I don't know if that matters. I just thought I should be clear about that point. But now I understand we've moved on to a different point about
If you'd like to discuss those accounts. And
no, I certainly don't. No, we agree on that point. I just misspoke and I should have corrected that. So we're talking
so let me break my question down.
Yeah.
I've moved again, I've shifted in time a bit, and I'm in the era when the augmentation to $4 is being discussed.
Yes.
And there's correspondence we've seen between Oliver Mowat and Edward Blake about that.
I don't remember if it was between Mowat and Blake, but each of them agreed that an increase was warranted.
I thought the men were writing each other at some point, if that's
That
wrong,
might
doesn't
be
matter.
correct. I just don't remember that specifically.
And maybe if I can phrase it more generally, then Canada and whomever was writing to Ontario was saying, you know, what's going on with these revenues and can we augment? Is that right?
I'm not sure I quite understand that question. I think that what I think I meant to suggest is that all parties agreed by 1875 that they could augment the payments to $4 per person.
Right, but that didn't come out of thin air. You mentioned to us earlier that beginning in 1873 or so, there were a number of petitions that were being directed from either Simon Dawson or Mr. Boren, I think you said, to the Governor General of Canada asking for an increase. Is that right?
That's correct.
Okay.
Yeah. I
And
guess-
then
sorry.
what sort of has to happen
Mhm.
is because it's been asked for, Canada is coming to Ontario and saying, has the augmentation clause in the treaty been triggered? Are there enough revenues to justify, I think your word was, an increase? You agree with me on that?
Yes, that inquiry was made. I think probably the point that I wish to clarify is I don't think at this point there was a systematic accounting of revenues and expenditures. It was just a general understanding that, oh yes, surely we've reached this level, and everybody seemed to agree on it.
Okay. And then while there was agreement, it seems that they had reached a level to increase the annuities to $4.
Yes.
There was not an agreement as to who should be paying those. Is that fair?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, but that's really what I was starting to sort of think about. And I asked you if you agreed with me that in the course of these discussions about augmenting, Ontario certainly expressed its view that if augmentation were to occur, Ontario was not responsible for the payment of that increased amount. Do you agree with that?
That was certainly Oliver Mowat's position, that he didn't believe Ontario was liable for it. He said that he would accept that the payments should be commenced without prejudice as to who would ultimately be found responsible. Yeah.
That's right. And ultimately, I think that is what I'm thinking of, where he was writing, I thought, to Mr. Blake, and Mr. Mowat suggests that this be done without prejudice to the two governments figuring it out.
Yes, yeah.
So let's turn to compendium tab 10, please. Now, this is one of those documents that I confess are awful to
Oh,
try to
goodness.
read.
Okay. Wow.
Colleague is bringing it up on the screen. So I believe that this is Mr. Mowat, Premier and Attorney General Mowat's. It's a, bless you.
Thank you.
It's a memo of sorts. It doesn't have a recipient on it that I've seen.
I think it does actually at the bottom. I
Where do you
can't
see that?
quite, typically that's what they'll do under the signature to the left,
Oh, it's very
or not
faint, you're
signature,
right.
but so Minister of, would it say the Interior? That would be my guess, but I'd have to see a better copy to be sure of that.
Minister of the Interior.
That's just speculation. It's the Honorable and it's the Minister of.
Thank you for that.
And I think it might say the after, so that would lead me to infer that's the Interior, but again, it's just an inference. I don't know that for sure.
I think you're right, and I hadn't blown it up to 295% before to see that. So thank you for that. I was just going, I didn't,
Mhm,
to me,
yeah.
it doesn't matter who it was written to.
Sure.
In particular, I thought it was maybe a memo, but I'm happy to have your evidence that it looks like it's a letter, perhaps to somebody, the Minister of the Interior.
Uh-huh.
Trying to think of what other ministries were of the,
Yeah.
but, okay, so this is, we agree though, from Oliver Mowat, and it's dated October 14, 1875.
Sorry, date,
1874.
where's the date on it? Oh, yeah, there it is, I'm sorry. October 14th?
October 14th, it says Toronto, 14th October, 1874.
Correct, yeah.
And I think if you want to turn up your slide 171, I
Yeah,
think this is what you referred to there, so it might help you to have your slide.
yeah, I do remember referring to this document.
Okay. And you say that Mr. Mowat denied that Ontario had any liability for increased annuities.
Yes,
And then this whole, do you agree with me that this whole letter is in the context of increased annuity payments?
yes.
And then if we look at page 3, highlighted a portion there,
Ooh, now, which page 3?
and at page 148, which is the third
148,
page of
got
this letter.
Okay.
And this is Mr. Mowat. He says, the question of the liability of Ontario in respect of the Indian annuities was fully discussed by the respective council for the provinces of Ontario and Quebec before the arbitrators appointed under the British North America Act. I've actually said that out. I apologize. It says BNA Act. And the undersigned is of opinion that the arguments which were advanced by counsel then representing Ontario and which were afterward printed established conclusively that this province is not liable to be charged with the Indian annuities. You see that?
Yes, I do.
So do you agree with me that, this is one of the reasons why is saying that Ontario is not responsible? You can pay $4 if you wish, but Ontario is not responsible for paying it. Do you agree with that?
That was Mowat's
Mowat's view.
argument, yeah.
And then if we turn back a page, 147 of the compendium. And this is the middle of the page. Another reason why he seems to be suggesting, in addition to the arbitrators, and I should ask you before we go to that, when Mr. Mowat was talking about the arguments advanced by counsel in the arbitrators, do you agree with me that that's the 1870 arbitration he's talking about?
Yes, I do.
Okay,
Could
so-
I just get your question 2 questions ago? You said you quoted from the letter which references the arbitration, and you asked the question, but do you agree with me that this is one of the reasons he's saying Ontario is not responsible? And this is the discussion that happened in the 1870 arbitrations?
Yes, thank you. One of the reasons why Mr. Mowat is saying, in his view, that Ontario is not responsible for paying increased annuities is because of what was argued before the 1870 arbitrators. And I
And-
think you agreed with that.
That
Professor
was,
Messamore.
that was Mowat's belief,
That's
yes,
Mowat's
or
belief.
argument, yes.
Does he reference what that argument was?
He does not in this
He
letter.
just says as a result of, or he just references arguments made.
That's right.
Is that right? So he's saying Ontario is not responsible for paying increased annuities as per the arguments already made in 1870. Thank you.
And then I was turning to page 2 of this letter, which is page 147. And in the middle of the page there, another reason I suggest, and you can tell me if you agree with me, that he's saying Ontario is not responsible, is that he's pointing to the policy of the BNA Act, placing all matters relating to the Indians under the exclusive authority of the Dominion Parliament and government. So it might be Mr. Mowat's view, but he's suggesting another reason why Ontario is not responsible is because it doesn't have jurisdiction under the BNA Act for Indians. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, that was right after the part where he dismissed the concept of Aboriginal title, I think, yeah.
And then just looking at this one. Your Honor, we're a little bit earlier than I suggested, but this next section, it's quite a bit more lengthy, and my own preference would be to not break it up. If we could stop now with your indulgence and pick up at 9 tomorrow.
It is hardly an indulgence.
Thank you.
So we'll break now and start at 9. Just let me catch up. All right.
Thank you.
Very good. So we'll break now and thank you.
All right. Oye, 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 the same code is correct after included, long as you can.